ages since I did one of these videos. I've been reading slower lately. I don't really know why that is, honestly. I've just been reading more slowly. But as a result, it feels like it's been ages since I did one of these videos. It feels like it's been ages since I read the first book. It must have been back in like early July or late June. As always, these are my very subjective opinions on these books. Everyone kind of feels differently about the stuff that they read, and that's the slice of life. I'm not here to judge the books or the authors or what they bring to the world, because I definitely value all these works whether I enjoy them or not, and the numerical rating that I give a book is ultimately very subjective. The first book here is one of the books I'm the most excited to talk about because I've been reading a bit more slowly lately. It feels like I read this ages ago, and I've been really excited to talk about it ever since, and it's Chlorine by Jade. So this book follows a swimmer named Ren. She's a competitive high school swimmer, and as the pressure of the competitive swimming scene starts to get to her, she starts to feel this desire to turn herself into a mermaid. I really adored this. This is one of my favorite books I've read so far this year, actually. It's so weird and bizarre. Almost the entire book is set at this swimming pool. We see a little bit of like Ren's house and, you know, some other friends' houses, but for the most part, it's set at the swimming pool. And it makes the pool feel like a world of itself. Like, I literally, one of my notes here is the pool had good world building. I'm serious. This swimming pool at a high school, grungy basement swimming pool, felt really well built as a world. The main character I thought was really well built, fascinating, really, really engaging and interesting. The kind of character whose yearning on the page feels super palpable. Her desires, her longing, it's kind of violent, and it feels like it's just like bursting off the page. I gave this 5 stars. I adored it. I did feel like the references to other mermaid stories, like at the beginning and a little bit throughout, felt a little jarring to me. Again, this is a if I were the author situation. But I'm not the author, so what does it really matter? If I were the author, I don't think I would have ever used the word mermaid. I think, to me, it kind of dispelled this beautifully enclosed, weird world that the story had. It almost felt out of time and place. Like, kind of, I don't actually remember if we have a canon setting, but it kind of just felt like it could be set in, you know, any town in America. Either way, it felt like we had this very enclosed world that was very general, but also very specific. The use of, like, external mythology, to me, kind of dispelled that. I don't know, it almost felt weird for her to label herself as a mermaid rather than this to be just like a myth of itself. Does that make sense? Anyways, that didn't impact my rating, but that was just one little thing that I felt a bit jarring that I would have done differently, where I wouldn't have made it that she has the desire to be a mermaid specifically, but more that this desire is just kind of within her and it doesn't need to be named. Like, we all know what a mermaid is. That was just a weird thought that I had, but I really, really enjoyed this book. When I say I want stories about unhinged sapphics, this is what I mean. So then I read The Guest by Emma Cline. I've been waiting for a new Emma Cline novel for years. I loved the girls. Her collection was kind of for me. This book follows the protagonist, Alex, who is alone on Long Island. We just follow her for about a week where she's essentially homeless, and we kind of just follow her manipulating different people for a place to stay over the course of this week. The writing was incredible. As always, it's Emma Cline. She can write, okay? We all know she can put a sentence together. The protagonist was really weird and interesting. I quite enjoyed the main character. I think my main issue for me was that the plot is quite repetitive. It's just this very repetitive cycle, which is interesting, but it gets a little baggy because it starts to feel like the kind of same repeated episode just with a different side character throughout the book. So I think I just started to lose interest the deeper we got into the book because you kind of know how it's going to play out. She's going to meet a character and she's going to take advantage of them and manipulate them, and then they're going to part ways, and then that same thing is going to happen kind of just over the course of the week. Kind of a weird, but like also kind of subtle book. So then I read The Adult by Bronwyn Fischer. So this book follows a university freshman who moves from kind of like this rural lake where her family own like a resort, which is where she grew up, to go to university, and she ends up having an affair with an older woman who she meets. It was really refreshing to read a book about a young person who actually felt 18. Natalie, the main character Natalie, she feels 18. She doesn't feel literary 18, she feels real 18. Relatability is not something I care that much about on my scale of what makes me enjoy a book. I don't really read to relate, but every once in a while it happens. And to me, this was probably for me the most relatable depiction of like first year of college, that I've ever seen. It was interesting that so much of the fuel of the book is on her confusion, and she's so aware of her youth. Nothing happens in this book, really nothing. But I couldn't put it down. I really flew through this. I found it super engaging, despite the fact that nothing happens. This is a really well done nothing happens book. I think I honestly just wanted a little more from Nora's character. Nora is the woman that Natalie's having this affair with, and I just wanted a little more from her character. But I thought that this was fantastic. To me, this is like the combination of The Idiot and What We Do in the Dark by Michelle Hart. It was like those two books combined, you'd get this. And I love both those books, so I love this. Then I read Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea by Rita Chang-Eppig. This was really a most anticipated read of the year for me. We follow this legendary pirate queen named Shek Young, childhood all the way through her adventures as pirate queen. The concepts and ideas here are so good, so interesting. Like I said, most anticipated read of the year for me. I really felt like I was wading through this. It was slow, and I don't normally mind a slower book, but not in a way that really engaged me. Like, there were a lot of points where I felt like it was just information and no story. And I felt like I was just kind of wading through a lot of information, and it started to feel a little almost textbooky. You know, the writing is very rich with detail and information. The historical setting is really convincing and fully rendered, but I found it hard to stay engaged with this one. I found myself not meaning to, but skimming at points because it just was not really holding my attention. I think because felt like a little dry at points, and when it was engaging, it was really, really engaging, but it wasn't holding me throughout, which was too bad. I was really, really excited about this one. Maybe if you are more of a historical reader and you kind of like that style, you might really, really enjoy this, but I think it wasn't for me. Then I read Big Shadow by Marta Balcewicz. This was also a most anticipated read for me. So this book follows Judy. She's also just graduated high school. She's taking some college courses over the summer, and she ends up meeting this visiting prof who used to be kind of very famous in like the punk scene, and she ends up going to New York with him, and they kind of end up fostering a relationship over the summer. I wanted to love this. I thought that I would love this. I suggested it for my book club. I unfortunately didn't love it. The elements were really interesting. Like, her friends are obsessed with this thing called like the Big Shadow, like this like weird culty belief that they have. A lot of interesting elements. To me, none of them ever did anything. This relationship with Maurice, okay, what came of it? The Big Shadow, what was the point of that? Like, nothing ever really amounted to anything, and it just started to feel really repetitive. There was no context to ground anything in meaning. Nothing really felt important, and the way the book was structured to me really minimized the tension. It was just her going back and forth to New York a bunch of times, but nothing really ever happened when she was there. The writing was good. You know, I gave it 3 stars because I think her writing is really, really good, and I do think that there's some moments of really great insight in the character. It kind of, to me, felt like it was written as a satire stylistically, but it wasn't doing satire, if that makes sense. Because I remember I was talking about this with my book club, and I was like, yeah, one thing that I find interesting is this is marketed as a dark comedy. And they were all like, oh, that makes sense, but I didn't get that vibe at all. But also, you wouldn't because it's not satirical, right? Like, it's not satirizing anything. Like, a satire has to be a satire of something. And so, as a result, you end up with this kind of satire-esque situation. Feels like if it had been a satire, it would have worked. It wasn't really a satire of anything. And so, it wasn't funny. And so, I felt like it was a book that was set up to be a satire, but then wasn't doing satire in any way. I don't know, like, I think that there were a lot of elements that you see a lot in this genre of literary fiction. And for me, this type of literary fiction, when it works, they're among my favorite books ever. But most of the time, they don't work. And I feel like this would have been really interesting if it had kind of been a satire of that genre. If the book had leaned into that aspect, it could have actually been really, really interesting, because then I think the situation would have made sense in that context. I couldn't really read it as like a drama that you were taking seriously because it wasn't deep enough. It wasn't cohesive enough. But I also couldn't really read it as a dark comedy because there was no comedy. This one felt kind of flat for me. It had a lot of really interesting elements, and the writing was like super solid and enjoyable. I do really, really like the way she writes. but the construction and cohesiveness of the book is kind of just a lot of going back and forth to New York and nothing really happening in these episodes. Then I read Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura, translated by Philip Gabriel. This is a fantastical kind of portal fantasy. We follow the main character Kokoro, and she's bullied really badly at school. And she discovers that through her mirror she can access this castle, and there's some other children there, and they're told by a woman wearing a fox mask that they have, I think it's about a year, I can't remember exactly, but they have until March of the next year to find, I think it's a key to a room in the castle that will grant them a wish. So Kokoro wants to find, because her wish is for these girls who are tormenting her, or this girl who's tormenting her, to cease to exist. Despite the style being pretty brisk, it's pretty slow. It's a lot of them just kind of wandering around this castle. There's a lot of characters introduced all at once, right at the beginning, so I found it hard to get a strong grasp on a lot of them. The depiction of bullying was really impactful. There were some really cool plot twists at the end that I found really interesting. I was a little underwhelmed by this just because the book itself is, it's whimsical and fun, which is nice, but it's pretty meandery, and the timeline is so drawn out that the stakes aren't really there, and the characters aren't trying that hard to achieve their goal. So a lot of the book is just kind of them hanging out and chatting in this castle, which I think was a little dry to me. Then I read Harrow by Joy Williams. I'm not even gonna bother trying to explain this book to you. This is one of the weirdest books I've ever read. This, to me, was weird and nonsensical. Extremely bizarre, kind of reminded me, the closest I can think of was The Beguiling by Gigi Gardner, where it's just everything is whack. Completely strange. I think I just never felt connected to any character at all. I couldn't really invest in the extremely strange events. I think if a book is gonna be so whack, it's a trip. I think there needs to be a heart there that you can connect to guide you through that, but I just didn't feel any connection to any character. They just weren't rendered enough for me. And so I kind of just ended up feeling disoriented the whole time. Then I read Your Love Is Not Good by Johanna Hedva. This was quite a treat, actually. So we follow a Korean-American painter who ends up becoming obsessed with this other artist named Hana. And she has this weird obsession, fascination, jealousy, attraction, everything at once to her. It's about this really weird relationship they have and the art scene, and it's really interesting. I loved it. Utterly weird and beautiful. Really beautiful. I actually couldn't put this down. It's a really cerebral book. I see why for some people it just feels like artists complaining about being artists, but I thought it was really interesting, and I thought that there was a lot of interesting tenderness there. And weird, the relationships were all super bizarre, but the character felt really real and strange and messy, and the parts of her that were uncomfortable and icky and scary were revealed. And so that's, I think, what I connect to a lot as a reader, and what makes the character feel really real to me is when the book maybe isn't scared of that aspects of the character. So I found this beautiful and mental, very, very cerebral. Just a few parts were a little shaky, especially near the end, hence the -0.5, but I did really enjoy this. After that, I read another weird lesbian sex book. Blue Hunger by Viola di Grado, translated by Jamie Richards. This book follows a unnamed young woman who, after her twin brother's death, moves from Italy to Shanghai to teach Italian there, and she ends up having an affair with one of her students, but they're the same age, named Zhu. This was a weird, hazy fever dream, kind of surreal, even though nothing really surreal happens. This was the lesbian version of Winter and Sakcho. Lonely young woman having a weird relationship, and nothing really happens, but the pace is really brisk, and it kind of knows just where to press. There's just this hazy electricity to this book that I really love. The writing is so beautiful, and not just because the words are strung together well, but because it pierces into the loneliness, and it creates this weird fever dream within the main character's mind. And I will say, when you read the back of this book, I was embarrassed to mark this on Goodreads. It sounds like an erotica. It's not. Is there a lot of sex in this book? Yes. They're weird scenes, but they're not that explicit. Is it also a fantastic book, one of the most well-written, weirdly human stories about grief and desire that I've read in a long time. Also, yes. So then the final book that I read was Linghun by Ai Jiang. This is like a horror gothic novella about this town called Home, where families who are grieving loved ones move into the houses in the hopes that the spirits of their loved ones will kind of haunt the house for them. So it's like this really interesting take on a haunted house. I felt that the primary novella in this book, Linghun, was really immersive and a really unique take on grief, both touching and disturbing at the same time. She toes this line that's kind of hard in horror, but between the book being as touching and tender as it is unsettling. And so it's what strengthens both elements. Like, it's unsettling because it's touching, and it's also touching because it's disturbing, right? Didn't feel that the other stories in the book really did much for me. This may be completely subjective. I don't really like multi-POV books where, like, there's, like, different POVs across the different... Like, it's really hard. Every once in a while it works well, and I think it's fine. But in this book, I think, you know, it is a kind of contained little story. And so having this really short novella split across multiple POVs with multiple different... It made it feel a little more manufactured than I think if it had been more seamless. I think the form was not as seamless as I personally like. This doesn't seem to be an issue for anyone else. I think this is maybe just very subjective. It's something that I find often just breaks a bit of immersion for me. That's all for this video. I'm gonna wrap this up because my battery is about to die. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear what you've been reading lately and especially what you've been loving. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!